So not exactly the best data slates for the boys and power armor. Let's talk about the big Space Marine nerfs coming out of the Munitorum field manual. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd go through the Space Marine points changes in detail and talk through why I think that the Space Marines have come out of the points and balance change update in a rather poor way, unfortunately. And even if they do have some breakthrough tournament success with some very specific lists, I wouldn't be too surprised if Marine players out there are struggling a bit to compete against their peers for a while after this. Prior to the update, core Codex Space Marines really weren't doing all that well at big tournaments, having win rates of around about 46% or so definitely on the lower end of Warhammer 40k as it goes, though still even with that not really so far out of the running that they couldn't compete with a good list played well. Space Marines I do think are a bit weird as an army out there. They just have so many ways that they can play their faction between all the different chapters that you can use for them, and then having more detachment choice than any other army at the moment, and then apply that to also having the codex with the most units on offer as well, so there's just loads and loads of choice available. Putting that all together often means that the average Space Marine list might not really be all that great, but the absolute most home competitive list can genuinely be very good. I feel like that's maybe the case with Space Marines at the moment, as they are still seeing tournament breakthrough, perhaps in particular with things like the Ultramarines Vanguard detachment with the Uriel Ventris, being able to do some crazy things, deep striking some devastated Centurions around, and Marnius Calgar infiltrating with aggressors. The internet does maybe seem to have settled on that as perhaps the single strongest core Space Marine build, although other things like Gladius, Ironstorm and Firestorm definitely still have success. It puts them in a bit of a weird situation where the average player might not necessarily be doing quite that well with them, but they still do win their share of tournaments. I feel like that's maybe put Games Workshop in a slightly tricky position, and I feel like they've maybe not done the best job with the balanced data slate, at least in my opinion. It really doesn't seem to have been too kind to standard Space Marines, and their top lists have been hit very, very hard, with only a few scattered buffs to things that were taken in a more niche capacity. I don't think it's going to be enough to make up for that. Given that their starting win rate was 46%, I feel like they've taken a nerf overall, and that probably means that they're heading for a power level towards the lower end of 40k. In this video I thought we'd talk through the positives for the faction, all the buffs that they've had, then talk through all the rather hefty nerfs, and finish up with a few thoughts as to where that might leave them. First up, perhaps one stealth buff from the codex has been to the Phobos captain, a stealth buff maybe being kind of appropriate given this guy's sneaky tactics. This one wasn't in either the balanced data slate or in the points changes, but in the designer's commentary, where it answered one question regarding redeploy abilities and whether or not they'd work with the infiltrators keyword. Previously I had seen a fair few tournaments where it said that basically if you were using an ability to redeploy a unit, they wouldn't then be allowed to use special deployment abilities like infiltrators. I just don't think that Games Workshop have made it entirely clear with that, and it is kind of an important question given that infiltrators redeploying it is maybe one of the most important uses of it, given that it basically has a unit that can really affect the enemy army in a meaningful way right from turn 1, potentially things like close range damage from first turn shooting and charges. You could set them up perfectly to deal damage or make nuisance move blocks all the way from turn 1, but then if your opponent lands first turn, you could then use the Phobos captain's redeploy ability to pull them back somewhere that's a bit more safe, maybe hiding in the midfield in a ruin on an objective for example. The Phobos captain does occasionally see some play. Obviously it's going to be better if you have plenty of Phobos units on the board. Some lists like to go heavy, though they're maybe a little bit more niche out there compared with some. But if you are running an army with a significant amount of infiltrators, then this guy got quite a significant boost and is a bit more tempting to take now. Otherwise, the major winners of the Munitorum field manual were the intercessors and a couple of units that fill into the same sort of battlefield role that they do. The most significant boost came to the Stern Guard, who dropped down from 100 points to 90, a nice 10% reduction there, though I feel like they were a unit that sorely needed a boost like that. Stern Guard started out with the addition being really quite strong, but then got a couple of quite major nerfs. Not being able to use old style Oath of Moment with the wound rerolls was a big deal for them, as it meant that they couldn't fish for devastating wounds as much, and the Codex update removed their double shoot once per game rule, which was really quite a big damage flurry. At 90 points though, these guys are looking significantly better for the cost. 3 shots at 12-inch range with bolters with the devastating wound special rule, plus a heavy bolter and a fairly scary power fist in combat. They're just looking like genuinely fairly scary frontline troops. I feel like if you just want Space Marines on the battle line dealing damage, these guys are really not that bad. They're pretty interesting for certain characters as well. Tigurius could be fun to throw into their unit, as he gives them a lot of extra benefits, including -1 to hit, some extra stratagem access, as well as chipping in with his very nice damage output in himself. Otherwise, the heavy intercessors are looking seriously better now, 100 points rather than 105, again they've been dropped. These guys I thought were genuinely quite nice, particularly in a more casual environment. Competitively, they were kind of rarely taken still, just due to either perhaps just being slightly overkill to hold home field objectives while still not really having all that much damage output, though the durability that they get for the points is seriously impressive. At 15 wounds worth of Gravis armor for 100 points, that does seem kind of fun to be honest. Again, maybe the main issue is competition with the other choices more so than them being a bad unit in their own right. They're definitely quite fun in Anvil Siege Force. The new Leviathan Infirmus Marines went down to 80 points from 85, and again they fell into a similar sort of role as the other frontline troops. These guys would be a bit better for pushing forward towards central objectives and then having a fairly hefty overwatch threat. They can be quite good damage dealers in their own right as well in the Firestorm detachment with the devastating wounds, or in Salamanders with Vulcan. The standard intercessors dropped down from 85 points to 80, and these were definitely a unit that people took in competitive lists on occasion. Definitely not making every single competitive list, but the standard Space Marine battle line is pretty handy to have with that sticky objectives rule that they get. They could mark the home objective to give you more flexibility with scoring, and then make their way towards the midfield potentially to try and skirmish with some enemy light infantry plus their power fist. They can be a fairly nice cheap alternative to the company heroes if you just want a fairly minimal investment squad to have a carrot to wander around with as well. Finally, the Assault Intercessors are now the cheapest power armoured equivalents in the Codex at 75 points per 5. Again, they definitely cropped up in competitive lists. Little minimal investment squads that are pretty good for skirmishing with enemy lighter troops to take and hold, and they get the special rule to allow you to reroll wound rolls against enemies on objectives, which definitely helped with that. It could be actually quite a nice way to boost a lighter melee character. Potentially with the character's damage output with 4 rerolls to wound, it could actually be really quite a lot more threatening. Overall, I feel like we'll see a lot more lists taking at least some of these. I do feel like a unit class that you probably only want to go so heavy on and not take absolutely loads of investment in though, as you still need things that can take down heavies. Maybe it's a bit disappointing not to see the Tactical Marines on this list. Looks like they're going to be the same price as Intercessors and more expensive than Assault Intercessors. They look like one of the units that really needed a drop the most. Otherwise, the Primaris Outrider bikes got the biggest relative points decrease in the Codex. They dropped down from 95 points to 80 points, a 16% decrease, though I would say that they were units that absolutely needed it. They were one of the weaker units in Codex Space Marines in my estimation. 95 points was kind of fine for their toughness and mobility, but their damage output is kind of weedy. Just mass strength 4 AP-1 will only threaten lighter infantry and not really worry things like, say, Terminators or vehicles. They're just not very general purpose. Overall, I think that 80 points is much more in line with their abilities. You could genuinely have a pretty tanky and very fast list if you took a fair few of these. I feel like they'll be a very credible option versus Jump Intercessors for the more nuisance interference Space Marine skirmish unit type role. They're genuinely massively tough for the cost at 80 points for 12 wounds worth of Outrider. They're really fast with their 18-inch movement if they advance, and their limited damage output is a lot more acceptable for an 80-point unit versus a 95-point one. And that 80 points also means that they're a better sacrificial unit, where you could actually have them be a bit more expendable and not worry as much about their loss compared with costing almost 100 points. They might be kind of interesting for the Dark Angels Raven Wing when we get their points cost for their Codex. That detachment does have a lot of boost for them, and they might have genuinely gone down enough to make White Scars players at least think about giving Outrider Stormlance a try, though I feel like it's still not going to compete with the Space Wolf Thunderwolves, at least in a competitive environment. Overall, it's just quite nice to see these guys looking kind of good though. Finally, for the boss, we have a small decrease to Gilliman. He's dropped from 360 down to 350 for the Ultramarines. Unfortunately, that's just a very tiny relative decrease, just down 3%. Not really enough to be meaningful in my opinion. Definitely doesn't hurt given that most Ultramarines lists tended to be building around Calgar and Uriel Ventris for some of the best Ultramarines builds out there. I think unfortunately Calgar still gives significantly more bang for your buck than the Primarch. I think it would have taken a bit of a bigger points drop on this guy to see him be one of the strongest things in the Ultramarines roster. That's the positive stuff, though now unfortunately we move forward to the nerfs, where unfortunately some real staples of the codex have gone up, and by quite a bit. Starting out with the squads, I'd say that perhaps the two most impactful changes are the Inceptors and the Scout squad. The Inceptors have gone up all the way to 130 points from 110, jumping far past the 115 they were at the edition's start, and the Scout squad's gone up from 55 to 65, both of those being 18% increases, so really quite big nerfs there. And it is kind of unfortunate for the Space Marines, as these were two of the most commonly played units in the army, really quite easy ones that you could throw into just about every list and not be a wrong choice. So I think that these nerfs will have a pretty direct impact on the power level of the faction. Inceptors are pretty great because they can drop just outside of 3 inches, have genuinely fairly good damage output, but perhaps almost as importantly can be important for doing things like secondary objectives or occasionally sneaking primaries. Going all the way up to 130 points will make them a much more luxury choice for this role. Occasionally lists were spamming these guys, now I feel like a lot of lists just won't bother with them at all, or maybe take perhaps 1 or 2 units and accept that you're paying a bit of a premium for them. Maybe some units like jump intercessors or suppressors might see a little bit more of a look given now the points are different. Scouts, I did feel like they were a bit weirdly cheap at 55 points for that cost to get that kind of power squad in the midfield right from turn 1. I did feel like was almost a too good opportunity to pass up. At 65 I still think they'll be playable. They're maybe just a bit more in line with the other infiltration units that you've got, things like eliminators or infiltrators, both of which have draws of their own. I think they're still playable and aren't useless. It is a little bit of a facepalm moment whenever Games Workshop has something out for so long that they nerf them before their individual kit has come out though. We're still waiting for the one from the Scouts after the Kill Team release. Otherwise, another staple unit going up are Aggressors, going from 110 to 120. These guys were quite commonly seen jumping out of a Land Raider, occasionally with other interesting ways to deliver them, such as the infiltration thing in Vanguard Spearhead, maybe with Calgar. They're just commonly considered a very strong unit to build around. Not actually very good defense for the cost despite the Gravis armor, but just bucket loads of close range damage, lots of twin-linked bolt or flame shots, and then back that up with a massive amount of power fist attacks with twin links. They were the choice for certain combos like the Gladius Fire Discipline and the Firestorm Devastating Wounds. Again, like the rest, aren't unplayable, but they're just less efficient than before, and given how many lists were using them, it is going to impact the strength of Space Marines in general. Finally, for the squads, the Centurion Devastators take a small points increase, going up from 175 to 185 per 3 of them. They were generally most being played in the Vanguard Spearhead to be able to zip them on and off the board with stratagems, bypassing their main weakness in that they don't move around fast, as their damage output is pretty good. They're still alright really, and they haven't taken the biggest hit in the world. They'll still be great in Vanguard Spearhead, but overall there'll be a small nerf to that particular list. Finally, we've got a couple of vehicles nerfed. The Redemptor Dreadnought at 210 points, up from 200. Again, kind of a small change, but does take the shine off these, at least somewhat commonly played competitively, as just a fairly strong all-rounder that you can't go too far wrong with. A bit of solid damage at range, and then backed up by some melee threats. It feels a bit more balanced versus the Brutalis before, which I would have rated it as stronger than before. Again, not a good thing to have a solid unit nerfed though in a faction that doesn't seem to be performing crazily standout, at least for the average player. And finally, perhaps the single worst points change of the lot is the Whirlwind, which I'd say unlike the others hasn't just increased the points where it's a bit more niche but usable, but has just taken it out altogether. This one's gone up from 145 points to a whopping 180, a massive 24% increase, so the worst single nerf out of any of these. I think this will go from a fairly common staple, just with maybe one of them in the backfield, maybe even spamming them in Ironstorm or Anvil, to just not really being worth it for the amount of damage that you get for the points, even with the bonus of indirect fire. Games Workshop does seem to have been on a bit of a purge of indirect fire units in the balanced data slate. A fair few of the ones that were actually played, like the Night Spinner, Manticore, or Plague Burst Crawler, all went up, and the Whirlwind seems to have got caught in that. Not really a great change though. I feel like they could have made the cost a bit more fair without being overly punitive like this. Maybe something like 155 could have been fine if they just wanted to tone it down a bit. Overall, I must admit I don't think that this is the most positive data slate change for the Space Marines. For the majority of players playing them, they were an army that was kind of alright, but not desperately strong, towards the lower end of 40k, even if a few top players with very specific builds were doing well with them. I'd argue that the nerfs far outweigh the buffs here. They've weakened 5 of the strongest and most commonly played Space Marine datasheets, and the Devastator Centurions that were kind of a bit more specific to one build and maybe not as common outside of that. The buffs that they've given are more sort of taking niche units and making them a bit more playable, not really making them bastions of strength that are going to carry the faction in damage dealing or objective scoring. Though don't get me wrong, I've got nothing against the intercessors getting a bit better and being a bit more interesting to play commonly in army lists. It's perhaps a bit disappointing that a few more of the weaker things didn't get buffs at the same time. Things like tactical squads and reavers I would have ranked worse than any of the intercessor variants, yet they remain untouched. And other things like the Desolation Squad and the Firestrike turret both are weak for the cost, and things like the smaller Storm Flyers and the Hammerfall Bunker, they've been bad for a while now, though Games Workshop seem to be neglecting both flyers and fortifications as things that they try and balance. Overall, the buff should see a few more troops on the table in Space Marine lists, and make them have to seriously think about their objective support options, whether they're going for Inceptors and Scouts over things like Eliminators or Suppressors or Jump Intercessors. I feel like there's going to be a lot more thinking as to what things move around and score your secondary objectives, as opposed to perhaps the default being those 2 units. Overall, from the changes, I would say that internal balance within the codex will likely be improved with this. Some of the absolute auto-include things are not quite so much, and a few of the weaker things are a bit more tempting. But I'd also guess, as well as that internal balance, Space Marine armies as a whole will be taking a bit of a power cut, not really something that they needed right now. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you make of the Space Marine changes, and how will it affect your army list going forward? Will you be putting more intercessors on the table, and what will you be using for objective support and things? Look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I will have a fair few more for the balanced data slate. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which you can find linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.